When it comes to enterprise hypervisors, vSphere is probably one of the most common out there. Do you know how to get it set up and running? If not, this video is for you. So welcome everybody. What my goal is for this video is to show you how to get the enterprise vSphere hypervisor installed, configured, and kind of some of the fun things it can do. Now, it brings up a good point in that there's the free edition, which is bound to, say, a few CPU cores. It can't do things like storage vMotion or distributed switches or NetFlow on the distributed switches, and there's a decent amount of feature sets you can't do for free. But there's also a decent amount you can, and the install, whether you're doing the paid Enterprise Plus or Cloud editions versus the free edition, is the same. So if you want to say you have capabilities and you know about vSphere and how to install it and configure it, join it to vCenter, and, well, that's my goal for this video. Now, it brings me up to a good point before we get started, in that you can do the free edition. You just have to register an account, download the ISO, install. You can also do trial for a few days to do the enterprise feature sets. And what you might do is, if you're a small business, you could buy an essentials kit. Or if you're just trying to do this in a lab, you can sign up and subscribe to a VMware user group, and you can get a vMug lab license, which is a low-cost, all enterprise capabilities license. So regardless, check into those. If you're just trying to do this on a low budget, just do the free version. But let's go through this. So what I want to show you is how to get vSphere installed and join it to a cluster, assuming you have more than one, with vCenter. So first thing we need to do is we need to download the vSphere ISO. So step one. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type vSphere download. This will take me over here. I'm going to do the download VMware vSphere. You could technically change this a little bit and do download vSphere free, which will have a different download link where you can get the free edition. Basically, it'll register you for a license. So you would have to create an account if you don't have one and then log in, and then you would download the ISO here. You could also try to download vCenter. Same thing, download vCenter. And you might have to get this on a trial, but basically you're going to download an ISO for vSphere, the free edition if you want to do the free edition, and vCenter if you're going to test that out. vCenter, there's not a free edition, at least not to my knowledge. There hasn't been one, so it's just vSphere free if you're going to do the free edition. I already have these pre-downloaded, so step one, download ISOs complete. Step two, I need to build an installation media, a USB, for vSphere. So for this, I tend to use Rufus. So if you download Rufus, rufus.ie, there is an installable version, this link, or there's a portable version, the link right below. Once that's on your box, install it just like you would anything else, and then launch it. So I have Rufus 3.14 on my box. It does prompt for admin because you'll need that to format a USB drive. And what I usually do is I don't yet have the USB plugged in because this will auto detect new USB storage devices. So it kind of safely helps me find the right device in case you have more than one. So I'm going to plug this in real quick. There we go. And now notice here in a second, there it goes. It grabbed the drive. Couple things here though. I'm still doing an ISO image. I'm gonna hit select, and I'm gonna select the vSphere ISO I downloaded, which is this one. Now when I hit open, Rufus will try to auto set some things. When I first did this on my box, it did GPT, which means it has to be used on a BIOS system that boots with UEFI. For a lot of older hardware, this won't work very well. So what I would probably recommend you do is set this to MBR, which should work for BIOS or UEFI. And when you select that, if you first install Rufus, you might have a pop-up saying one of the config files is old and outdated in the ISO that you selected. Can Rufus reach out and download a newer one? And you'll have to say yes. It's fine, it takes like 2 seconds. And then from here, I'm just going to hit start. It's going to pop up and say, hey, you sure you want to wipe out this thumb drive? And it's going to wipe the entire thumb drive out. So make sure you don't have any pictures or anything on it, and then hit OK. This takes a minute or two. And when it's done, what we'll do is we'll move to whatever server workstation hardware you're having. We'll plug it in and we'll try to boot to the vSphere installer and go from there. Just being honest, there's a decent amount of hardware that's not going to work with vSphere. I'm going to demo on an HP Z620 I bought off of eBay. That's what I use in my lab environment. But if you're doing workstations, you might have to find some modified ISOs to get like network drivers or storage drivers. So there's a lot of hardware that it's just not going to work with these. Servers tend to work way better. Workstations, not so much. So here we go. I'm now ready. I can go move and plug this into a box, and I can boot to it and start the install process. So step 1, we've got the ISOs downloaded. Step 2, we've got a bootable USB drive. Step 3, we're going to install using that USB device. So at this point, what we're going to do is boot to the USB drive, and I'm going to start the installer. So here it's going through and it's booting to the vSphere installation media. Sometimes this can take an extremely long time. Others, it seems like it boots very quickly. So we'll give this a second, let that boot up. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and start the installation wizard. So I'm going to hit enter to continue. And then from here, I'm going to accept the end user license agreement. This is going to scan for whatever local storage I have. In this server, I actually have multiple devices. I'm just going to select the first one, which is a 1 terabyte SSD drive I have. You can have some issues if you select specialty drives, like sometimes the NVMe doesn't work very well depending on the version you're installing, but I'm just going to do the first. Since I previously had ESX on this, it's detecting it. I'm going to select the blast box, which will just delete everything I previously had and start over. From here, I'm going to go ahead and set my password. I'm not sharing that, sorry. I selected US default because I'm in English, set a password, and then from here, I'm getting a warning of, hey, your hardware is not on the compatibility guide. Are you sure you want to do this? Now, it still says it's still supported. It's just in the next release it's not going to be. It's because I'm using older hardware. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. Well, hit enter. And then from here, I just need to start the install. That's pretty much it from installing vSphere. The hard part is configuring it. So now we'll give it a second to go ahead and complete. All right, so now at this point, the installation's done. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter to reboot the server. And when this starts, you do need to pull the USB drive out. Otherwise, it'll boot right back into the installer depending on how you have your boot order. So you can go ahead and safely unplug it at this point and reboot the box. Now, it will take a second to boot up again, so let's give it just a second, and then we'll pick up configuration once it's booted up. All right, so now that the server's booted up, I'm going to press F2 and I'm going to start configuring this. What I initially want to do is get the networking set up. So I'm going to log in, and then from here, I'm going to go over to Configure Management Network because I need to get it configured. I usually will select the network adapters because I want at least 2 for redundancy. If you're only using 1 NIC, that's fine. So I'll select whatever NICs you're using, then hit enter. Then from here, if you're doing tagged VLANing, you'll need to set this. I'm setting 300, assuming my switch has a tagged port of 300. And then I would recommend you set a static IP. So I'm going to select that, and I'm going to go ahead and enter one of 192.168.0.101 for my environment with a 255.255.255.0 subnet mask and a gateway of 192.168.0.1. Again, this will have to be specific to your environment. And then I like to turn off IPv6 because I don't use it. And then if you're setting DNS or a suffix, you would. We'll set that later in the web interface. So from here, you'll hit escape, and you'll say yes to save changes and reboot. At this point, you've got the main stuff configured that you need to be in front of the computer for. The rest will start configuring through the web interface. So if you have more than one server, rinse and repeat what we just did. So the next step, what we're trying to do is configure vSphere. For this, I have 3 hosts. I have HTTPS 192.168.0.101. I have 102 and 103. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to each one of those. And then what we want to do is we want to start to configure these, because by default there's things I didn't yet set up. Like I didn't set up DNS, I didn't give each box its own host name, I didn't install license keys, and I haven't configured the vMkernel to support any enterprise features, assuming you add it to a vCenter box. So let's do that. So I'm going to log into each one of these. So you're going to rinse and repeat a lot of this over and over in each box. And let's first kind of knock some of this out. First things first, I want to give each one their own names. Notice up top, each tab says localhost still. So for this, I'm going to click on networking. And you need to flip to the TCP IP stack. This is where, because I didn't set DNS and hostname at the keyboard at the console, I'm going to do it here. So I'll click on the default TCP IP stack, and I'm going to click edit. So this box, I'm just going to name, I'll call it ESX01 or vSphere 01. I know technically ESX has transitioned to vSphere, but I still call it ESX. For the domain, I'm just going to use a mock domain, vSphere.local. And I'm going to set my DNS servers for now to Cloudflare's DNS servers. I'm going to use vSphere.local, hit save. I'm going to rinse and repeat this on the other boxes as well. TCP stack, edit. This would be ESX02, vSphere.local, 111.1.1.1001, vSphere.local, save. Same thing over here. TCPI stack, edit, here we go. This will be ESX03, vSphere.local, vSphere.local, save. Now, the other thing I like to do once I know I have DNS in place is I want to make sure each of these servers is set up to do time synchronization, because I want all my virtual machines and everything to be in sync. And it can cause issues when I later join vCenter if I don't have proper time. That's under Manage, and I configure it under System tab, Time and Date. So I'm going to edit NTP, and I'm going to set this to start and stop with the host. And you can set this to an IP list comma separated. I tend to use pool servers like 0.pool.ntp.org, 1.pool.ntp.org. 2.pool.ntp.org, and there's a third one as well. So I'll go ahead and grab these. You want usually at least 3 so you can have quorum. So I'm going to save that. Now notice it still says it's stopped. And it's kind of weird because I would assume I click on actions and start, but you have to go to services, find NTP in here, then start it. And you can go back and let's see, refresh. Running, yay! Okay, so we got NTP up and running. I'm going to do that on the other boxes as well. So edit NTP, start and stop with host, paste my time servers, service, start. Do that in the first box as well. Edit, start and stop with host. There they are. Services, NTP, start. The other thing we might do since we're over here is click on licensing. And if you have a license key for like the free edition or one of the paid editions or vMug editions, click assign and go ahead and assign it. We can also do that later with vCenter if you're doing vCenter, or if you're just going to run this in eval mode. I have all the features currently enabled while I'm in evaluation mode. Another thing I need to do is I need to go back to networking under vMkernels, and I need to edit my vMkernel. This is kind of weird. In VMware's hypervisor, there's this concept called a vMkernel. Think of it as the virtual IP that can be used for things like management, for vMotion, like moving a system from one box to another, for fault tolerance, where it creates like a replicate clone, actual replication, and a bunch of other feature sets. By default, you have one vMkernel, and in a lab, you probably only going to have one. You can change this, but just let me show this for a second. I'm going to edit this. And in a lab, if I was just using, say I have 2 NICs in each of my systems, but I'm only going to have one vMkernel, and I'm just going to say all the features, the enterprise features, I want you to use on this one virtual kernel. I'm going to hit save, and that virtual kernel is assigned to my management network port group, which is on my single virtual switch. It gets really confusing. Virtual switch is where I'm actually tying my physical adapters. So I have 2 physical adapters currently assigned to vSwitch 0. Let me show you this picture here. Oh, not here. Let me see if I can drill down into this. There we go. Oh, come on. And I'm going to move my thing around here. This kind of shows a nice picture right here, vSwitch topology. I have 2 physical NICs, they call them uplinks, plugged into this virtual box, this kind of gray scale box. And from here I can have port groups, which for the most part are just how we assign VLANs. And then you can have virtual machines or kernels attached to those port groups. So earlier when I did the install, I set it to VLAN 300, but then I realized that I have what's called a general mode switch, meaning if I don't tag a VLAN, it's 300 in my environment. Everything else I have to tag. I'll come back to that. That's confusing. Let's stick to one concept at a time. So what I'm doing here then is I have one vMkernel, it's 192.168.0.101, on a port group called management network. I'm not setting a VLAN ID, which means on my switch, it's actually going to be 300 under the hood. And that can be on any of these 2 NICs. So I have redundancy. And because I enabled all those additional feature sets, I can connect to NFS shares, I can do iSCSI, I can do vMotion off this vMkernel. What you might do in a production environment though is you might have, let's say I had 2 more additional NICs, so I had 4 in total. What I might do there is create another virtual switch, assign 2 NICs to it, and have a vMkernel that's dedicated to say NFS or iSCSI access. Why? Because then they can't physically cross from one virtual switch to another, from those 2 adapters to these 2 adapters. So it's more inherently secure. And also because it's high bandwidth. So now I could have like 2 10 gig NICs for iSCSI. They're load balanced, they're redundant, and so there might be causes where you'll have more than one vMkernel for that reason. In fact, for iSCSI, you might actually have a virtual switch with 2 physical adapters, and you might have 2 vMkernels, 2 separate IPs, because of the way you can do load balancing with iSCSI. So it can get advanced pretty quickly, but it's cool. You have lots of options, which is also why it's confusing. So for the lab, again, kind of what I would probably do is for your vMkernel, I would go ahead and enable all the checkboxes so you can do all the things with a simplified network. Okay, so I've got that configured. But in my environment, and what I would kind of recommend if you have the hardware to do it, is I don't want to have all my virtual machines on the same subnet. I want to have multiple subnets and multiple VLANs But as soon as you have multiple VLANs, it means whatever switch you're using better support it. So I don't have virtual machines that use no VLAN ID. All my virtual machines need to have VLANs. So for example, I have a network I call infrastructure, and it's on VLAN 100. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. I'm getting rid of the default VM network. I have a security VLAN. I'm going to go ahead and create a new one here. I'm going to click on, let's see here. I'm going to go to port groups here, add port group. I have one called security. This is where I'll put like my IDSs and things like that. That's on VLAN 101. I have a port group called logging, where I tend to use my SIM components and my analytics. That's on VLAN 700. And so what I'll do is I'll start creating these VLANs as port groups, and then I make sure they show up on my virtual switch. So virtual switch 0, there's logging, security, infrastructure. But watch this. This is something that I'll usually do. I'm going to go back to my port groups. Now notice security I have as VLAN 101. I'm going to create another port group that is also in the same VLAN ID, 101. But I'm going to call this one IDS. Okay. And actually, I'm not going to do that. I'll come back to why I was even thinking that. I'm going to actually change this to 4095, which in vSphere non-distributed switches means every VLAN. I'm also going to expand security. This is inheriting the security settings from my virtual switch, and I'm going to override them and say for my IDS network, which is all VLAN traffic, you can enter promiscuous mode, so you can see everybody's traffic. You could technically send packets that have in MAC addresses that didn't come from the hypervisor or that are completely forged. And so you can change MAC addresses, all that. I'm going to allow the IDS to do whatever it wants. I'm going to hit add. And then on the virtual switch, I'm going to make sure my default policy is what I want it to be. So I'm going to go to edit, and under security, I want them all to be set to rejected. Meaning a virtual machine, you can't enter promiscuous mode. You might think you are, but you're not allowed to see other traffic. This is helping locking down. I can't forge MAC addresses and use MAC addresses that didn't come from the hypervisor, which is added security. We'll break virtual machines that need to do like virtual MAC addresses like for load balancing or other like clusters. So you might intentionally need to create a duplicate port group, same VLAN ID, but allow, say, MAC address changes or forged transmits, but only for special use cases. So I'm going to go ahead and, I didn't make any changes, so I'm just going to hit cancel here. And now I've got these. The problem is, I don't have them on my other boxes. So we did 100, 101, 740, 95. I need to go do the same things over here. vMkernel, edit settings. I'm going to check these boxes so it can use any of the feature sets. I'm going to go to my virtual switch, and we're going to make some changes. I'm actually going to just go to networking, port groups, VM network. I'm going to rename the infrastructure because I don't want to have a default network called VM network. If I was doing distributed switching, you would wait and do all this later within vCenter because it would handle all this for you. I'm just showing it this way. So 100. I'm going to add, we had security, 101, and we had logging, 700, and then I had IDS. I technically have a lot more than that, but I'm just going to do what I need to do to show you this video. IDS, 4095. Again, 4095 means all VLANs, so it can see everything on a standard switch. I'll do the same thing over here. Go to networking, and do the vMkernel before I forget, edit settings, check all the boxes, save, and port groups, edit. This will be infrastructure 100. The naming is actually important because if I was to move virtual machines between hosts, and the names didn't match, it can cause issues. So So you do need to make sure you don't have typos here. Again, while why distributed switches through vCenter is cleaner, we're just going to keep going with it this way. And one more. So at this point, once I make this last change, I'm actually going to set this to 4096 for a second to see if it barks it. Okay, good. Yeah, I was making sure it's 4095. At this point, I'm actually ready to start deploying virtual machines. Now, I didn't set DNS initially, and mine's currently set to Cloudflare, because usually what I want to do is deploy Active Directory domain on top of these systems. And then I'll use vCenter and point at those systems. And so there's kind of a chicken and egg problem in that DNS, I can't point to those yet because they don't exist yet. And so what you might do is actually install Active Directory first, then set up vCenter, because in your home lab, you're probably virtualizing everything. I'm going to do it backwards. I'm going to install vCenter, and then later on in a different video, I'll install Active Directory. But that means my vCenter, I'm not going to join it initially to Active Directory, so I'm going to use local accounts, and that's fine for me for my lab. So I'm done with vSphere. What I need to do in my final step is actually deploy vCenter and then configure all my boxes to be joined under that vCenter. So let's move on then to step 5, deploying vCenter. I have vCenter downloaded. So I'm going to go to my downloads folder, and I have VCSA. And hopefully I downloaded the right one. We'll see here in a second. I'm going to double click on this, which will mount it because I'm on Windows 10. And I'm going to find the installer. I'm going to use the UI installer, which is the GUI. I'll just do the Windows one. You technically should be able to do this on a Mac or Linux. I'm just going to do it on Windows because I'm on Windows. And I'm going to run the installer. I'll give that a second to pop up. There we go. And this is kind of a wizard you just kind of walk through. So I'm going to hit install. I'm going to go ahead and deploy. I'm going to accept the terms in the end user license agreement. And I'm just going to point this at my first box. In a production environment, I would definitely recommend you do this with the fully qualified domain name. Again, I don't have DNS servers, I don't have anything because I'm starting with hypervisors. So I can't do that. So I'm going to point at an IP address. In a production environment, you should have a DNS already. The problem is this is kind of, once you deploy it, for the most part, you don't change this, which is why it really should have been a name first. For a lab, this is fine. I'm going to hard code it via IP. I'm going to use the root account that I set during installation. There we go. It's going to say, hey, there's a untrusted cert because it's not a trusted cert. I mean, even up top, you can see all these say they're not secure. It's because they're self-signed. I'm going to hit yes. And what do I want to call it? I'm just going to leave the default name of VMware vCenter Server. I'm going to set a password for it. Make sure you remember your passwords here. It's going to ask me how big will my environment get to. With being a home lab, most of you are probably going to be tiny's fine. I often set mine to at least small because I can get over 100 VMs. But you're probably going to do tiny or small. Select them according to the table below. I'm not going to have 100 hosts, but I can have over 100 virtual machines, which is why I set it to small. And we'll go storage. How much disk do you think you want to use? I just tend to leave that at default. Where do I want this to go? Well, I only set up one data store, so it's going right there. The difference is, do I want vCenter to pre-allocate all the disk, which is the default, and I don't want it to do that. Or do I want it thin disk, meaning only consume storage as it actually needs the space. So the difference here is it might use, 100, like if you had 100 gigabyte VM, it would use all 100 gig by default. If I say thin disk, it starts at 0, and as it uses space, it grows up to 100 gig. I'm going to enable thin disk mode. There can be performance implications if the disk constantly grows. But for our lab, that shouldn't really be the case, and I have fast enough disks anyway, so go. If you're doing vSAN, which allows you to take the local disks of multiple hosts and create a cluster like hyperconverged storage, which is a lot of fun, you can try to get that set up from scratch right during this install. I wouldn't recommend that necessarily. Usually what I would do is go ahead and start the install and do vSAN later, and then migrate the disks. So I'm just going to proceed. It's going to ask me to get a IP or name to vCenter. I'm going to place this on my infrastructure VLAN. I'm going to set it as a static IP, and I'm not going to give it a name for right now. I'm going to give it 192.168.104, 255.255.0, default gateway of 1, and I'm going to use Cloudflare for right now, because I'm just going to use local accounts when I'm connecting to vCenter. And then I'm going to hit finish. If you want to watch this GUI will kind of show you the status. You technically can also go to the first box, and you'll see it down here. Importing VApp, and you'll kind of see a few tasks popping in down here. So I'm going to kind of put this up here, and we can also kind of watch it over here. This is a fairly big application, so we'll give it just a second to deploy. All right, so now vCenter is deployed. It now needs configured. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to connect to the IP for that box. And I'm just going to hit continue, which will actually connect over to it. And this is going to kind of finish the deployment. So I'm going to hit next. I do want time synchronization. You can do with NTP or ESXi, it really doesn't matter. So long as your ESXi is also doing NTP. I'm gonna use it with ESX. For production, usually we don't enable SSH. I'm gonna go ahead and enable it just because it's in my lab and I want access. So next. Give this a second. There we go. I'm going to set up a password for accessing vCenter, the SSO configuration. Again, I'm just using all local accounts for now. Oh, that's because I didn't put the domain. I saw it there, thought it was there, it was not. All right. There we go. And here we go. And finish the deployment, please. Go. And now we'll give this a second. And when it's done, we should be able to connect to vCenter's IP or name if you did an FQDN. And you could start to manage all your hosts from there, which we'll be able to finish this guide pretty quickly from there. So we'll give this a second. Fingers crossed, right? We'll be able to connect to it and start using it. So let's give it a shot. Let's try connecting to 192.168.0.104 is what I have it in my environment. Oh, that's a good sign. Continue. Launch vSphere client. And let's see if I can authenticate in here. So this will be, I believe I called mine administrator at vSphere.local. And yay! All right, looks like it's going to work. So at this point, we have 3 vSphere boxes. We have vCenter installed. Now we just got to combine them all together. You should have licenses in production. I'm just going to move forward here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do right-click on the vCenter over here. I'm going to do a new data center. I'm just going to call this test. And then I'm going to right-click on that, and I'm going to do a new cluster. I'll just call this cluster for now. And if I was going to enable distributed resource scheduling, which would auto vMotion machines around, I would check DRS. If I want high availability, which would be if I have a virtual machine running and for some reason the host can't be found, it's not heartbeating, it'll relaunch it on a different machine. You would enable that. And if you're doing vSAN, if you have the local disk to support vSAN, you could check that as well so that as you add your hosts, vSAN gets enabled. I'm going to leave that one unchecked for now. So do next, finish. And now I can start adding my host to it. Add hosts. I'm going to do 192.168.0.101, root, put my password in. I'm going to go ahead and just do all of them. Oh, and I'm going to say use the same credentials because I did set them the same. And let's see if this works. 103, next. Okay. Oh, check. Okay. Next. Finish. And so what should start happening is they should start getting added into this cluster. You'll see this statuses down below. And as long as this all works, notice they just migrated into the cluster. 2 of them show up as in maintenance. 1 will not because vCenter's on it. And so you'll see it's getting all the agents and stuff deployed on here. And we'll see if we get any errors. We might get one on 101 because vCenter's there and it wants to go into maintenance mode for this, but we'll see. Definitely makes it challenging trying to get vCenter on the same box. If there's an error, we can still deal with this later though. We'll wait for this and let it finish its tasks. But at this point, as long as this finishes and there's not a huge red flag, I'm ready to start deploying virtual machines as I see fit. And you now have vCenter up. That means you can go through, start setting up things like patch policies. I usually will start installing like Windows operating systems and Linux operating systems to get templates so that you can deploy from template rather than fresh installing all the time. Looks like we're good. I can tell these to exit out of maintenance mode. Exit, exit. Those will come out. Notice it's going to start installing the agents on those as well. And then from here, we're good. vCenter's installed. I'm ready to deploy virtual machines. I'm just going to show one quick deployment real quick. I'm going to do, let's switch to virtual machine view for a second. On my test, I'm just going to do a new folder. We'll call this a virtual machine folder. Normally what I would first do is probably create a template folder. And I would do something like deploy a new virtual machine, brand new. Let's say I'll call this Ubuntu 2004. Next, next. Select the data store. This is going to hard lock it to one box because my disks are local currently until I do vSAN or set up like an NFS share. That's fine. This would be a Linux box. Ubuntu 64-bit. I can start to set my CPUs, like I might do 2 with 4 gig of RAM, a 40 gig hard drive. You configure this. Make sure you specify whether it's thick or thin You probably want thin, but the default is thick. Remember, that's whether it hard allocates the size or not. And then what network you want to drop it on. So we'll browse. I'm going to do infrastructure. Next. If you had an ISO, you could point out the ISO. I'm just going to do next, finish. Now, this is intended for me to install Ubuntu 20.04. It doesn't have it yet. But what you would do from here is you would power it on. I'm going to launch. You can do the remote console, which you might have to install, or the web console. I'm just do the web console for now. And it's trying to boot up, but there's nothing there. So from here, this is where you would either mount an ISO over the remote console, or you would upload it to one of the disks, and you would do edit settings. And for the CD-ROM, you could actually point it to a data store ISO, and then install Ubuntu. And when you're done, you would nicely power this off. I'm just going to forcefully shut it down. Yes. And had Ubuntu been installed in here, I could say right-click, template, convert to template, and notice the icon image changes a little bit. And now I can deploy from template, which is one of the powers of vCenter. So hopefully this video helped you get started. There's still a whole bunch of stuff I can cover at a later date, like distributed switching, how to do things like mirroring, whether it's port mirroring, things like NetFlow, you name it. There's a whole bunch of additional capabilities within vCenter especially. So, but this will at least get you started, see how those components link up, deploy cluster, add hosts, and now you can start managing everything centrally with vCenter. So, if you like this video, please subscribe and stay tuned for more. Also, don't forget in the comments that if you want to see something specific or have questions, let me know. Let's do this.